Hi guys, thanks for stopping down at Pete's Garage. Well, now we're going to talk about cylinder heads and engine building. Now when you go to buy your cylinder heads, whether you're building a new engine or you're just taking the cylinder heads off your engine because you want to increase performance on your engine, there's a few things you got to know. First of all, you're going to have to decide what you want to get, aluminum or cast iron. You get an aluminum cylinder head, it's going to cost about twice as much as a cast iron cylinder head. However, it weighs half as much. So you spend more money and you get half the weight. You get better heat transfer through aluminum cylinder head as well. Now we're going to talk about with cylinder heads, we're going to talk about CCing the cylinder heads, how to CC your cylinder heads so you know what the combustion chamber volume is. And that's important when you calculate your compression ratio. And we're going to go into dynamic compression ratio, which is extremely important as it relates to the octane of gas that you're going to use. There's a difference between regular compression ratio and dynamic compression ratio, and I'll show you the calculations of that. We'll go through some samples. But it's very important when determining your compression ratio of the engine and what octane fuel you're going to choose. Okay? And then we'll talk about flow of the cylinder heads, what are good ratios, and how to choose a cylinder head based on flow. Now there are some basic rules of thumb I can give you right off the bat. And in terms of flow, a cylinder head that flows 300 cubic feet of air per minute is going to produce roughly 600 horsepower. So you're good for up to 600 horsepower with a 300 cubic feet per minute head. That's one rule of thumb. So the higher flow or the higher horsepower you need, the more flow you're going to need. The cylinder head are the lungs of your engine, and that's what makes them breathe. So the faster you can get the fuel in, and the more efficiently you can get the exhaust out, you're going to help your engine out and gain a lot of horsepower that way. There are a lot of other changes or a lot of things to consider when you're talking about compression ratios and octane ratings on fuels, and that's because the higher your compression ratio, the higher octane fuel you're going to need. The higher octane fuel you use, the hotter it's going to burn. The hotter it burns, the hotter the cylinder head is going to get. So you have to be prepared to exhaust or dissipate the heat from the cylinder heads as fast as possible. If you don't dissipate that heat and you get a lot of buildup inside the cylinder, heat buildup, what's going to lead to is you're going to melt cylinders, you're going to blow right through cylinder heads, piston heads. You're going to melt valves, burn the valves, edge of the valves. You're going to blow up your engine if you don't get rid of the heat and use a high octane fuel, high compression engine, and you don't get rid of that heat properly. So everything is all tied together here today. We're tied together the cam and what the specifications on the cam that you need to know when you're choosing your cylinder head, because the degrees of rotation of the cam after bottom dead center, when the valves are completely closed, will tell you your dynamic compression ratio as it relates to the cc's of the cylinder head and how much horsepower you can anticipate getting out of your entire cylinder head or your choice for your engine. What kind of flow you need coming in, what kind of intake, what kind of exhaust, and what you need to do to make sure that the cylinder heads you're purchasing are right for the application you're working on right now. So before we get into all the calculations and all the information, let's talk about octane. And I'll make up a quick chart and show you the different compression ratios and how they relate to octane ratings in gasoline. So let's go to the whiteboard for that one. Okay, compression ratios as they relate to octane requirements for an engine. Now, as we go down the chart here, we're talking about this. We're talking here right now about regular static compression ratios. This is going to be as measured as your already calculated or measured in your engine. If you have a compression ratio of 8 to 1, you're going to have an octane requirement of your engine of a low to a high. It's going to be about 87 to 92 for 8 to 1. 9 to 1, you're looking at 89 to 96. 10 to 1 is 91 to 100. 11 to 1, you're starting to get up there in compression. 96 to 102, and 12 to 1, pretty high compression. You're talking a 100 to 108 racing fuels. When you're talking about racing fuels up here, the higher the octane, the more expensive you're going to get. So you're building an engine, you start building these higher compression engines, and you're going to have a hard time finding racing fuels to put in your car for a regular street engine. And at $8-9 a gallon in late 2013, it can be pretty expensive to fill up your car if you're going to choose a high compression engine. Now, the compression ratio of your engine is directly related to the octane But this is more specifically related to the dynamic compression engine of the engine, which is two different things. Dynamic compression and the regular calculated compression or swept compression ratios are different. And I'm going to go through that after we go through CCing some cylinder heads. Before I do those calculations, I'm going to show you how to CC a cylinder head, and it's very important that you do that so you understand exactly what the combustion chamber volume is in the cylinder head, because that number is critical to the equations that I'm going to show you. So let's go CC a cylinder head. Okay, now I'm going to check the CC, or I'm going to measure the CC cubic centimeters of this combustion chamber right here. And all you need to do that is your cylinder head, of course, and I have it sitting on a tabletop on a slight angle. It's not completely flat, it's on a slight angle because we're going to fill this cavity up with water. So you need your cylinder head, some water, you need some petroleum jelly. I just have regular petroleum jelly here. You need a measurement device. This is a child's cough medicine or syrup measurement device. You can buy it at a drugstore, and it measures in milliliters. This measures in milliliters, but 1 milliliter is 1 cubic centimeter. So we're going to be able to measure cubic centimeters with this. I'll fill it up with water, and the only other thing you need is a piece of plastic, a clear piece of plastic with a hole drilled in there big enough for you to get the tip of the syringe in here and leave enough room so that the air can come out as you're filling it up, okay? So what I've done is I took my petroleum jelly and I took it on my finger and I put it around the valves to make sure the valves are all sealed right here like that. I've put some in a spark plug hole to seal that to make sure that it's not going to leak at all, and I've removed everything around the edge here. So the combustion chamber is completely clean, and all I done, I took some of the petroleum jelly just like this, and I put it around the outside of the combustion chamber just like this, just to provide a temporary gasket. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece of plastic and I'm going to place this on here, and you can see this hole. This hole I'm going to place right towards the top of the combustion chamber, because as I fill this up I want the air to escape and I want the chamber to fill up with water. So I'm going to hold this, I'm going to press this down so it seals all the way around. You'll be able to see that. Just like that. I'm going to seal that. Now, I'm going to take my syringe, which roll away. Where is my syringe? We're having technical difficulties. Oh, that's it right here. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill up this syringe, and I'll hold it this way so you can see. I'm going to fill it up to the 10 milliliter, which is 10 cc's, okay? I'm going to fill it up with water, and I'm going to make sure I'm right to that 10 cc point. Okay, got it just like that. You can see I got it filled up to 10 cc's, got my water in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in here, and I'm going to start pumping water in here. I'm just going to fill this up with water. Just like that. Oop, you don't want to do that too much because you got to have it very, very accurate. So I'll get it to 10 cc's again. So that's 10. There's 20. Okay. Here's another 10. There's 30. There's 40. Here's another 10. Here's 50. You can see it's starting to fill up. Starting to come up on here. There's 50 cc, so almost all the way full. Okay, one more. It's going to fill up even more. There's another 10. So I got 60 cc's. Now I'm going to measure right up to 10. I'm almost done, so I'm going to put this in real slow. So I will push this in right till it fills up right to the top, right about there. And I'm right at about 10, and I put in 6.5. So it's about 66.5 cc's of combustion chamber volume in this combustion chamber. You want to check all the chambers in your head, and check both cylinder heads to make sure they match, because one side could be different than the other depending on how they're machined. So you check them both, and then we'll talk about the difference between the two once you determine. So I got 66.5 cc's in this combustion chamber right now for this cylinder head. So now the question is, why is the dynamic compression ratio important? It's important because it's different. The actual compression of the engine, the compression ratio after the valves are closed, the actual compression is different than the compression ratio at full stroke. Now let me give you a simple example. Let's say we have a 350 engine, and we calculate it has a 9.1 static compression ratio. We measured the sweep of the cylinder. We know how long the stroke is. We know the volume of the heads, and it's a 9.1 static compression ratio. And let's say we throw in a 252 cam. A 252 cam with a 110 degree lobe separation angle and 106 of the indicated lift for the intake valve lift. The intake close point on this kind of cam is going to have 52 degrees after bottom dead center. That means in the calculation the dynamic compression ratio is going to be 7.93 to 1, which is dynamic compression ratio calculated based on all these factors. If we took the same engine and put in a 292 cam that had a 72 degrees of intake valve closed with 72 degrees after bottom dead center, the dynamic compression ratio would come out to be 6.87 to 1. Now we need to get this 6.87 to 1 up to at least 8.5 to 1. Ideally, the range we want to get is 8.5 to 9.5 to 1 for a good race engine. So this dynamic compression ratio needs to get to 8.5 to 1, or translate 9.5 to 1, which means we got to get, since there's a full, you can see the difference here is between 7.93 and 6.87. There's almost a full, it's almost 1. It's almost 1 compression ratio bigger. So we have to get this 9.5 to 1. If I had a dynamic compression ratio, this translates from 6.871 to 8.5 actual compression ratio, which means we need to get this up to 9.5 to 1. In order to get this 9.5 to 1, there's someone knocking on my door, but I'm going to finish this anyway. We got to get this up to a 10.1, 10 to 1 compression ratio on this engine in order to get the dynamic compression ratio to be effective in this engine. And let me show you why that's important. Okay, someone was knocking at my door. I had to stop and do that. But anyway, I want to continue. I want to explain this part a little bit better because I think it was confusing here. Most gas engines make the best power when a dynamic compression ratio is between 7.5 and 8.5 on a 91 or better octane gas. So the larger the cam's dynamic compression ratio falls outside this range, it would have less torque and lower RPM, primarily due to the lower cylinder pressure, and there will be a substantial amount of reversion back into the intake because of this, because of the intake tracker. Higher RPM will be down. There's all kinds of problems with that, since the engine would not be able to fully utilize all the extra air-fuel mixture provided by the ramming effect of the engine and the late intake closing of the valve with the lobe separation angle. If you recall in my cam video, I talked about cam cards, reading cam cards, and on a cam card here, it'll tell you when the intake and exhaust valves are closed after bottom dead center, 47 degrees, and before bottom dead center on intake and exhaust. So your cam card is going to tell you this information here about when and how many degrees after bottom dead center your intake valve is closed. So, that said, racing engines use high octane gas. They can tolerate a higher dynamic compression ratio with like 8.8 to 1 to like 9.1. That's a good dynamic compression ratio to shoot for. 8.5, 8.8 to 9.5 to 1 is a good one to shoot for. Now, in order to reach the if we want to reach the static compression ratio needed to reach this 9.1 or 9.4 dynamic 9.5 to 1 dynamic compression ratio with a 292 cam right there, we would have to take this engine, and actually we would have to get this compression up to 12 to 1. We would have to get an engine, this compression up to 12 to 1 to get a dynamic compression ratio of 9.5 to 1. And you can see the difference here. The difference being that you can measure and say I have a 12 to 1 compression ratio, but what is your cam timing? When does the valve completely closed? What is your dynamic compression? And what are you actually compressing? And how much is the fuel? What octane are you burning? That is the key to dynamic compression ratio. If someone says I have a 12 to 1 engine, or my engine's burning 11.5 to 1, well, that's fantastic. What's your dynamic compression ratio? If you have a really a lane cam in there, or the cam is too far advanced, you could be robbing yourself of horsepower, all because you're not setting your dynamic compression ratio right. And that is all determined by measuring your CCs, knowing what your cam is going to be doing, and then calculating what your dynamic compression ratio is. Let's go through a calculation right now for dynamic compression ratio so you can know how to calculate yours. Okay, now before we do a calculation on dynamic compression ratio, we need some variables we have to identify. These are some things we have to know. We have to know what's going to be known as the RD. This is the rod horizontal displacement in inches. Rod horizontal displacement in inches. How much does it displace? The ICA, the advertised intake close angle in degrees after bottom dead center. That'll be off your cam card. The RR is something. This is the rod distance in inches below the crank center line. The RL, we need to know our rod length. We're going to use all that to calculate our PP1. That's our piston rise from the RR, from the rod distance in inches below the crank, in inches on the crank center line. Our PR1 is the piston rise from the crank center line. How much is the piston rise from the crank center line? Our ST, we need to know stroke, and the ST, or dynamic stroke length, that is after the intake valve closes. So how much is the rod stroking after the intake valve closes? Now let's go into the formulas for calculating dynamic compression ratio. Okay, so we have the variables that we know, we measure, and these are the formulas in order to calculate our dynamic stroke. RD equals 1/2 of the stroke times the sine of the angle of the 72 degrees. In this case, this comes out to 0.2538. The RR, it's 1/2 of the stroke times the cosine of the angle of 72 degrees. This comes out to negative 0.9673. PR1 is the square root of the RL times the RL minus the RD times the RD. Subtract those two, the double parenthesis, square root, this comes out to 2.9356. If I take PR1 and the PR2 equals PR1 minus RR. If I do that, it comes out to 1.7134. And the dynamic stroke equals our stroke, and I'm assuming a stroke of 3.5. If I take that and I subtract the double parenthesis of PR2 plus 1/2 of the stroke minus the RL, let's say this is a 3, the rod length of a 3. To take this figured out, it comes out to 3.0366 inches. This is the dynamic stroke length. This is the distance remaining after top dead center after the intake valve closes. So you might have a 3.5 inch stroke length on your rod, but after going through the calculations, knowing how many degrees after bottom dead center your intake valve is closed, you know that you have roughly 3.0366 inches of stroke of actual compressed air where the cylinder is completely shut for dynamic compression. That's going to calculate. That's the number we're going to use, 3.0366. Now, how does this all relate to the CCs of the head, the stroke, and compression with octane? I'm going to tie this all together. Let me erase this. We'll go into what this all means for your cylinder heads, choosing your cylinder heads with your cam, and how you can adjust these angles. You want more angle after bottom dead center, when you want this degrees to be closed, how you choose your cam to make sure that you're matching it up with your heads properly. Okay, so what the hell does it all mean? Why dynamic versus actual swept compression ratio? Incidentally, if you don't want to go through all these calculations, there's an app for this. You can go to engine2lbox.com. They have apps. You can download an app to calculate all this stuff. You just need to know some information about your cam and your engine, and it'll do all these calculations for you. I'm just showing you the theory behind it so you understand why choosing your cylinder heads and understanding your CCs are important. Now, this is what we did. We just went through that exercise, and based on a rod travel or rod length 3.5 inch stroke, we calculated that the dynamic compression stroke was 3.0366 inches. So you can see, even though the stroke of a cylinder or stroke of a rod is 3.5 inches, After the valve closes, after the intake valve closes, when you have true compression, you only have 3.0366 inches of actual compression. That's different. So what I did was, for the Cobra motor that I'm building now and the heads I just CC'd, I redid the calculations and I'll show you how this works. I calculated the volume of one cylinder. If you need the information how to calculate the volume of the cylinder, it's in here. This includes, the volume of the cylinder includes the deck height is in there, and the dome dish, the piston. You know, if you have a dome or a dish, you got to take that all out of there, but I'm not going to go through all that. But anyway, the 351, my Cobra engine, it comes out to 638.4 cc's for one cylinder. And if you recall, when I CC'd the cylinder head, there was a 66.5 cc's of in the combustion chamber. So if I take the total volume divided by 66.5, I get a compression ratio of 9.6 to 1. That's where I'm running at for my compression ratio raw. However, when I take into account that my cam has the intake valve closed at 47 degrees after bottom dead center, if I recalculate my rod ratio to get the difference between my rod length and my dynamic rod length, it comes out to 591.85 cubic centimeters divided by the same number, my chamber volume of 66.5. My dynamic compression ratio is 8.9 to 1. So this is what I'm actually basing my octane fuel need on. I'm basing my octane fuel need on my dynamic compression ratio, not on my swept or actual calculated dynamic compression ratio. Those are the two different ones. You see how they're close? They're pretty close, but they're different. And it's different. And you can manipulate these numbers by getting a different CC head and changing where, after bottom dead center, your cam closes the intake valve. So what does this all have to do with cylinder heads? Let me erase this and I'll show you what I mean. This is what it's all about, guys. You're choosing a set of cylinder heads. You know what your compression ratio wants to be. You know you got a block, you know your stroke, you know your piston, you know all that stuff about your piston heads, and you have to choose a set of cylinder heads. What do you buy? You buy 55 cc, 60 cc heads, 65 cc. What do you buy? What do you buy? After you go, you got to do those calculations. And again, if you don't want to go through the calculations, go to engine2allbox.com, get the app. It'll figure it out for you. This is why you need to know that. Let's say I do all the calculations, and I know that my engine has a. Let me make this easy. Of course, it's going to be a mess. Let's say that I do the calculations, and let's make the numbers a little bit higher. Let's say I do the calculations and my engine comes out to like a 10.5 to 1, calculate the actual ratio, the compression ratio. I do all the calculations and it comes out to like a 9.9 to 1 for a dynamic compression ratio. That 9.9 to 1 is a little bit high if you're gonna want to run it on regular pump gas. So you might want to lower that a little bit. The only way you can lower that is of a few things. You can either put a gasket between the block and the head to increase the cylinder volume, which will lower your compression ratio. You can buy a set, let's say that's based on a 55 cc head. You want to lower your compression ratio? All you have to do is get a different cc head. You want to divide it by a bigger number. So you get a 60 cc head. Dividing your total volume by a larger number will give you a lower compression ratio. So you're choosing your head to change your compression ratio. You're increasing your combustion chamber volume in the cylinder head to get a lower dynamic compression ratio. Or you're going to put a gasket between the block and the head to increase your combustion chamber volume. This is what dynamic and static compression is all about right there. Understanding the difference between the two numbers, what happens after your intake valve closed, will help you choose what size cylinder heads you buy for your application. That's how you choose for your compression ratio. I know that was really confusing, but I had to go through it so you can understand where these numbers come from and why they're important to understand the difference between the two. Now, we'll wrap this up. We'll talk about flow. Do I get my head, do I put them on a Flowbench? What it's worth it? Let me erase this. Let's talk about cylinder head flow, and that'll wrap it up for how to choose cylinder heads. Okay, so now we talk about flow. That's the last thing when you look at your cylinder head, you're talking about flow. It would probably be a bad judgment to purchase your heads based on what a Flowbench says. If one person puts a head on a Flowbench and gets 270 cubic feet per minute, and someone else puts it on another Flowbench and you get 280 cubic feet per minute, all you're doing is racing one Flowbench against another. So Flowbench is not necessarily the only reason or the only way to buy a cylinder head. Again, I said roughly something that flows 300 CFM is going to get you about 600 horsepower. That's a good, good ballpark figure to go on. But when you're talking about flow, it all has to do with intake and exhaust port designs. You might think that, okay, I want more flow, I'll just increase my intake port. Well, that would be true. You would increase your intake port, you get more flow through the valves, but a larger volume in your intake port is going to give you less velocity of your fuel travel. So the slower your fuel gets in there, you might get less fuel into the cylinder because of the velocity is decreased. Just like a smaller, if you choose a head with a too small of an intake port, you won't have enough volume in there to get everything you need to get in to suck in to provide you with the horsepower, or to supply enough air for the engine to breathe to produce the amount of horsepower you're trying to produce. Also, exhaust ports. We're looking for a ratio here. Let's say, for example, your intake port flows 280 cubic feet per minute, okay? And let's say you measure your exhaust port and it's flowing 185 cubic feet per minute. That's roughly about 75%. The exhaust is flowing about 75% of the intake. And that's a pretty good number. You don't want to go below 75%. 80% is better. The higher you can get, the better. But you can remember the exhaust is under compression. It's firing, it's coming out hot, and it's moving out faster. So the intake is going to be larger than the exhaust. So when you go and buy based on flow, and you're looking at the flow, you have to match a few things. You have to match your port design with your intake design to make sure it's correct. You're going to have either a carb or fuel injection. You want to make sure the air is going to get in there properly. The atomized air-fuel mixture is going to get in there properly. It's going to burn properly, and it's going to get out of the engine as fast as possible and as efficiently as possible, so the heads are going to flow nice. Flow nice not meaning volume of flow, but flow nice meaning evenly. It's going to be balanced. If it's not balanced, you'll lose torque, you lose power, you'll have a hard time. You'll have to put a lot of timing into it to get it to run right. So my recommendation is, when you figure out what you think you want, I would definitely call either the customer service or the tech support for the cylinder head manufacturer and tell them exactly what you're planning on doing and get their opinion. Or call whoever you're going to purchase from, someone you can count on, and say, hey, look, I'm planning on buying a 65cc head. This is my engine. This is the kind of intake I'm using. This is my stroke. Here's all the information I have. This is my compression ratio. I'm planning on running on 100 octane fuel. How do you think that'll flow? And they'll tell you, no, you might have to go up or down on the cc's. Or if you're buying it for an engine that you already have in your car and you just want to replace cylinder heads, you might have to increase the combustion chamber volume with a gasket. Or you get a 65 or 60cc head, you might have to have a thousandth or something taken off the surface of the face, have it faced off just to close it down to close the compression ratio. So there's a lot of things that you have to work with many people to make sure you're choosing the right cylinder head for your application, because you can definitely starve it for horsepower and air, you can rob it of horsepower and air, or you can restrict it from getting rid of the exhaust fumes, which will again rob horsepower and rob a whole bunch of different things. Now, I hope that helped you out understand a little bit about cylinder heads, buying cylinder heads for your application. There are different shapes, all different kinds of things based on your application. So it's best to talk to the experts. We talked about the dynamic versus the regular compression ratio for your dynamic compression ratio, which are two totally different things. Showed you how to CC a cylinder head. Use that with just some petroleum jelly and a little measuring the syringe you can get at a drugstore, measure milliliters, which is cc's. Incidentally, I did plug the spark plug hole with petroleum jelly to make sure nothing would leak there. We looked at how to cc the head. We looked at what the measurements mean, the formulas for calculating compression ratios, dynamic stroke, which is how much the rod is going to stroke while the cylinders or the valves are closed. When the intake is valved, how much stroke is actually left. That's your dynamic compression versus your regular static compression. Two totally different things. The static compression, we looked at the compression ratios and what kind of fuels you're going to have to use, how much octane it's going to take to support the compression ratio, and what you're planning on doing. And finally, we looked at an actual calculation for these cylinder heads going on this engine. My 9.6, like 9.65 to 1 compression ratio with an 8.9 dynamic compression ratio based on, was it 47 degrees after bottom dead center for the intake valve being completely closed. Those are the relationships between all of those things, and you have to keep them all in mind and take them into account when you're building an engine, because it really is very, very important to make sure you're optimizing your cylinder head for the engine you're building. Again, if you don't want to go into all the calculations and have to worry about that, get an app, get an online. There's calculators for it. Engine2lbox.com, they have stuff there. I just mention them because I know what they're doing, and I've had a little input into some of their calculations and what they put on there, so I have a little more confidence in what they're doing. But you can go online and find many different things to help you do compression ratio, dynamic compression ratio calculators, cylinder calculation, all that stuff, all the volumes. You can calculate all that stuff with tools and little apps or small calculators to help you out. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to help you. Leave a comment, a question, and I'll answer it as soon as I possibly can. If I can't get you the answer, I will direct you to someone who can get you the answer. And if you need a little more in-depth explanation on something, I'll do the best I can. I really appreciate you watching these videos, and I hope they helped you somehow understand the importance of what you need to do when choosing a cylinder head and how the numbers, what they mean to each other. All the numbers mean something. The cam numbers mean something to the cylinder head. The cylinder head means something to the piston design. They all mean something to each other. So don't just blindly go and buy parts, throw them together, and hope they work. I really appreciate you stopping by. It's getting towards the end of the year. It's November. Next week is Thanksgiving in a couple weeks. And if I don't get a video up before then, I wish everybody a joyous and happy holiday season. I wish you all the best. Hope you get a lot of car parts for Christmas. And I really appreciate you stopping by Pete's Garage. Take care.